At 4:58 in the morning in Seattle, Washington, the nation's second-largest legal practice faced a reckoning. Two prominent Somali lawyers were detained accused of concealing lethal fentanyl for widespread distribution. The CJNG organization had concealed itself behind the protective barriers of the legal profession. This event was far more than a simple police action, it was a breach of national security. The country has just been roused from its slumber, so allow me to explain what transpired. The primary goal of the Homeland Security Task Force is to eradicate cartels, international gangs, and cross-border criminal syndicates operating within the U.S. Only a few days prior to Christmas, as Seattle enjoyed its festive lights and peaceful daily habits, federal officers were readying an assault that would break the facade of security. Precisely at 4:58 a.m., vehicles from ICE and the D navigated quietly through a neighborhood near the city center. There were no loud sirens or alerts, just the low hum of engines waiting in the darkness. Their objective was not a storage depot or a border checkpoint, but rather the second largest law firm in the country, a mighty entity famous for its clout, status, and legal power. As soon as the officers forced their way in, the stillness vanished immediately. Orders were shouted across the polished stone floors and within the glass-walled offices. Documents were confiscated, computer servers were disconnected, and secured meeting rooms were pried open. In a matter of minutes, 46-year-old Mohammed Hussein and his 34-year-old wife Faduma Ibrahim were arrested. While the public viewed them as top-tier lawyers, federal agents saw them as the nerve center of a CJNG cartel ring operating openly. As the teams locked down the premises, one reality became undeniable. This was no ordinary narcotics raid, it was evidence that a brutal cartel had entrenched itself within the American justice system until the quiet of that morning was shattered. Comment wake up if you are surprised that such events unfolded within a premier American law firm. Stick with this story because the actual scheme went much further down. As the inquiry progressed, the danger manifested itself not via shooting but through quiet infiltration. This was not a street-level hustle, it was a mechanism built to merge seamlessly into ordinary life in the U.S. Illicit substances flowed through spotless warehouses in the suburbs located only moments away from schools and residences. Delivery trucks pulled up during the day marked as carrying dietary supplements or medical equipment. Every aspect appeared standard, which was exactly the camouflage they used. Contained within were fentanyl and methamphetamine packaged tightly for large-scale circulation. These narcotics were molded into tablets that looked exactly like legitimate medication. Requests were sent via secure applications while money was transferred electronically. Parcels traveled along standard shipping paths, bypassing street corners and raising no red flags. It was simply toxin slipping into households without detection. The lethality of this network stemmed from its exacting precision. Deliveries were timetabled and transportation lanes had contingencies in place. Funds were structured in layers to withstand police raids and detentions. Detectives characterized it as a corporate enterprise constructed for mortality. The organization synchronized their supply with academic semesters and festive seasons, aiming at younger consumers initially. As one officer noted, this enterprise did not depend on brutality, it depended on being unseen. When households finally realized what was happening, the damage was already done. If this structure alarms you, please forward this clip to a loved one. The discoveries made subsequently by investigators turned a significant narcotics case into a nationwide emergency. This was far from a regional activity, it was a worldwide logistics chain designed to transport death with business-like accuracy. Government analysts followed the supply route across 3 separate continents. Raw chemical ingredients departed from Chinese harbors disguised as legitimate industrial cargo. These were redirected to labs in Sinaloa, Mexico, where syndicate chemists synthesized them into fentanyl and meth. From that point, the narcotics traversed the seas concealed within freight containers. The ocean had substituted the land border, rendering discovery significantly harder. Once the contraband entered the U.S., the stream of product never ceased. Cargo traveled eastward and then northward, supplying logistics centers before arriving in Seattle, where Hussein's group assumed command. Each phase was synchronized and every package was monitored. Financial losses were computed and written off as merely a cost of doing business. The toll on human life was absolutely catastrophic. During 2025, the state of Washington documented 3,588 fatalities due to overdose, with 76% involving fentanyl. King County crossed a morbid milestone, registering over 1,000 deaths within one calendar year. Across the country, fentanyl emerged as the top killer of U.S. citizens between 18 and 35, overtaking vehicle crashes and gun violence. Detectives cautioned that the confiscated fentanyl by itself could generate 6.9 million fatal dosages. That amount was sufficient to wipe out the inhabitants of Seattle and Tacoma several times over. This was not careless smuggling, it was wholesale distribution, a mechanism built to expand, tolerate setbacks, and continue operating. The challenge agents encountered was no longer about policing crime but rather containing destruction while racing against a superior system. There were 3,588 fatalities in a year and 6.9 million deadly doses were intercepted. At this juncture, the government ceased their surveillance and moved in for the takedown. Comment enough if you find 3,588 deaths in a single year to be intolerable. Once the magnitude of the danger became irrefutable, federal leadership executed a major pivot. This ceased to be an inquiry intended to silently collect proof. It transformed into a total interdiction, a synchronized attack aimed at shattering the CJNG web before it could evolve or vanish. Prior to sunrise, Washington state adopted a stance that high-ranking officials subsequently characterized as war-footing. Over 900 federal offices were mobilized from numerous different bureaus. The DICE, FBI, ATF, and state-level task forces were all involved. This was not merely one isolated raid, it was a harmonized campaign covering cities' outskirts, harbors, freeways, and country roads. As dawn began to break over Seattle, choppers ascended into the sky. Unmanned drones deployed over factory districts and housing areas, securing exit paths from the air. Down below, heavy armored trucks moved into their designated spots. SWAT teams lined up at entryways while hazmat crews waited ready for potential contact with toxic fentanyl and chemical traces. The mission commenced at exactly coordinated moments. Entry points were forced open at the same time across numerous sites. Inside storage depots, officers sawed through fortified padlocks as the suspects within ran around in disarray. At one location, security personnel with guns tried to escape via a cargo dock, only to be stopped by police dogs and aerial monitoring. Elsewhere, perpetrators attempted to ruin electronic data, crushing hard drives and mobiles before the agents burst in and took control. Shootouts were barely averted, not through fortune but through velocity. The federal squads acted more quickly than the criminal web could respond. Numerous firearms were discovered, fully loaded, positioned for protection. Volatile substances were found in airtight vessels, validating the detectives' fears that this situation could have turned violent instantly. Near the docks at maritime sites, hazardous material teams assumed command. Shipping crates were unlocked in regulated environments. Contained within were securely wrapped bundles of fentanyl and meth, some covered in materials meant to evade scanners. Officers operated in safety suits, aware that a tiny amount of dust in the atmosphere could kill. The mission continued without interruption. For 2 full days, squads worked in rotations, serving warrants, gathering proof, and moving prisoners. When it concluded, the statistics reflected a triumph similar to a military win. Tons of drugs were confiscated, guns were taken off the streets, and money alongside crypto assets were halted during transaction. Authorities subsequently verified that the Seattle strike disabled the CJNG supply lines to the East Coast, cutting off paths that supplied various states. Experts in intelligence calculated that this interference probably averted thousands of impending overdose fatalities. However, the psychological impact was arguably the most significant outcome. For the first instance, the syndicate's meticulously concealed infrastructure was exposed to the light. Its pretense of being unseeable was destroyed. The signal sent was crystal clear. This situation was no longer a playful chase. The US had decided to face the danger head-on, using power, organization, and determination. If you favor federal intervention against these syndicates, please like this post to amplify the statement. Once the assaults concluded and the commotion died down, detectives confronted a more difficult reality. The harm inflicted by this web did not vanish simply because people were handcuffed. What the ICE and FBI revealed was not merely a narcotics ring but a mechanism that had silently altered trust, business, and security in whole neighborhoods. Forensic accountants started following the cash flow. They discovered a labyrinth constructed to survive any individual police strike. Huge sums had flowed through crypto accounts, dummy corporations, and lawful trusts that looked legitimate from the outside. Bank accounts were created, shut down, and recreated using various identities. Earnings were divided into tiny, unnoticeable transactions that were scheduled to evade warning systems. This was not sloppy money cleaning, it was fiscal masking designed to appear dull and lawful. The misuse of legal standing was at the core of this framework. Agreements, rental contracts, and court documents served as protective barriers. Storage units were leased using standard business conditions. Transportation papers were filled out and stamped correctly. Every item passed through regular checks because nothing looked out of place. The syndicate did not smash the infrastructure from the exterior, they utilized the infrastructure exactly as intended but for illegal purposes. Reports on community effects depicted a dark scenario. In areas connected to the supply lines, 911 calls regarding overdoses had risen silently for months. Ambulance crews recounted visiting the same locations repeatedly. Medical centers noted increasing amounts of victims who thought they were consuming prescribed drugs. Relatives recounted the identical narrative to detectives over and over. There were no alerts, no prior issues, and no opportunities for redemption. Educational institutions were also affected. Officials verified that tablets connected to this group had found their way to students via informal sharing rather than dealers. A single pill identical to a real medicine was frequently sufficient to kill. Authorities stressed that this factor was what rendered the scheme so perilous. There was no obvious danger to steer clear of. Police chiefs admitted to another repercussion: the decay of public trust. Citizens wondered how such a scheme could persist for months without being spotted. The response was uneasy yet obvious. The web depended on normalcy, hiding behind documentation, professional conduct, and daily habits. It prospered because it did not appear illegal. Internal audits commenced throughout various bureaus and municipal offices. Transport methods were updated, checking standards were made stricter, and monetary monitoring was broadened. Yet leaders conceded that no defense is flawless when offenders are enduring orderly and prepared to bide their time. Government updates emphasized that the Seattle raid was not a conclusion but a caution. Cartels had realized that America's assets, its free market supply chains and trust-based structures, could be flipped into weaknesses. They would undoubtedly attempt this again elsewhere, adopting a new shape. For the detectives on the file, one deduction was prominent. This ring did not depend on terror or disorder, it capitalized on comfort and the public's view that threats always look threatening. When that perception was finally broken, the injury had already reached deep into households, classrooms, and bloodlines. The true war, they cautioned, was no longer merely against narcotics. It was a fight against apathy and the silent presumption that such a devastating force could never show up disguised as something familiar. As the probe went on, federal leaders started to concentrate on aspects that could not be boxed, recorded, or snapped in a photo. The gravest harm inflicted by this group was not quantified in weight of narcotics or piles of currency. It was calculated in shattered households, forfeited confidence, and an escalating dread moving silently through standard American existence. Medical data exposed a trend that had been developing well before the police strikes. Fatalities from overdoses were climbing not only in urban cores but in outskirts and little towns where people thought they were safe from gang brutality. First responders reported showing up at houses with no criminal past and no clear red flags. Fathers, grandmothers, and partners were left in shock, posing the identical query, asking how this occurred here. Physicians noted a disturbing pattern where numerous casualties did not think they were consuming illicit substances. They believed they were swallowing prescribed medicine, something known and relied upon. A single tablet, one portion, frequently resulted in death. The rapidity of fentanyl allowed for zero mistakes. For relatives, there was no slow deterioration or opportunity to step in, only a ring of the telephone in the dark. Senior citizens experienced the blow in a distinct way, yet just as intensely. Many were bringing up their grandkids while others looked after grown offspring, fighting dependency. Neighborhoods that previously depended on tight communal bonds now confronted distrust and worry. Individuals grew suspicious of parcels, strange couriers, and abrupt shifts in conduct. The feeling of security that characterized steady communities started to crumble. Police chiefs recognized the mental strain placed on emergency personnel. EMTs, fire crews, and cops expressed exhaustion and annoyance. Rescuing the same individuals over and over and occasionally failing exacted a severe mental price. The syndicate's commercial strategy did not merely destroy its targets, it ground down the guardians trying to save them. Clergy, principals, and local organizations were pulled into the reaction efforts. Gatherings were organized not to debate crime data but to manage sorrow, rage, and terror. Numerous locals wrestled with the understanding that the threat had not come with noise or violence. It had entered silently via mechanisms they had faith in. Government reports highlighted a grim fact: this emergency did not aim at one specific demographic. It traversed generations' salary levels and personal histories. It impacted ex-soldiers, pupils, white-collar workers and pensioners equally. The gang showed no bias, it merely leveraged openings. Leaders cautioned that this indiscrimination was the reason the danger was so acute. Conventional techniques for stopping crime were insufficient. There were no distinct street corners to bypass and no observable pushes to identify. The hazard traveled via known paths like delivery lines, internet sites, and daily purchases. Detectives stated that the takeaway was hurting but lucid. The battle against syndicate-fueled narcotics could not depend solely on policing. It demanded knowledge, dialogue, and watchfulness from the general population. Households required frank discussions, neighborhoods needed to remain watchful, and organizations had to adjust fast before another web found a method to merge in once more. What this investigation revealed was not just an illegal enterprise but a weakness in the nation's armor. Until that weak point is fixed, the menace stays silent, enduring, and expectant. When the federal updates got to DC, one deduction was inescapable. The raid in Seattle had not simply taken apart a cartel unit, it had unveiled a fresh stage of the narcotics conflict within the U.S. This issue was no longer concerning boundaries, walls, or remote trafficking paths. The danger had already traversed those markers and figured out how to exist swiftly within American structures. Authorities verified that the crackdown in Washington state critically impaired the CJNG's distribution to the East Coast. Intelligence experts calculated that thousands of packages were interrupted, redirected, or deserted. In real terms, that signified thousands of existences probably preserved. People who never got a box, never took a tablet, and never became another number. To the police, that was significant, yet nobody involved thought the risk was over. Criminal organizations evolve, which was the caution reiterated in private gatherings. When a path fails, a new one is trialed. When a technique is revealed, a more silent one is constructed. The identical rigor that permitted this group to conceal itself openly would be utilized again elsewhere under a fresh alias and behind another decent facade. Federal chiefs emphasized that this instance signified a watershed moment. It demonstrated that syndicate groups now function less like mobs and more like global corporations. They analyze economies, monitor consumer needs, and leverage tech quicker than laws can adapt. Furthermore, they depend on one perilous supposition, that the majority think something this cruel would be simple to spot. That very presumption is what permitted this web to expand. The situation in Seattle also compelled organizations to face awkward realities. Free markets rely on confidence, shipping relies on velocity, and legal or money systems rely on truthfulness. When those assets are abused, the destruction propagates softly and effectively. This is what rendered the menace so grave, not volume or disorder but quietness and habit. Leaders stress that policing by itself cannot sustain this struggle. Strikes can interrupt and detentions can break apart, but enduring protection demands public knowledge. Households must grasp that peril no longer appears perilous. Neighborhoods have to acknowledge that dependency does not always broadcast its presence. Organizations must presume they are marks, not exclusions. For senior citizens, the notification was particularly blunt. Many recalled previous narcotic epidemics that were observable, brutal, and contained. This situation was distinct. The threat came via known avenues, using known titles, and wearing known masks. It did not batter down gates, it strolled right through them. The Seattle mission demonstrated something else too. When bureaus collaborate, when data is exchanged, and when moves are definitive, the infrastructure can indeed resist. The syndicate did not anticipate swiftness of that magnitude. It did not foresee solidarity, nor did it expect its cloak of invisibility to be removed so totally. Yet authorities caution that winning must not breed self-satisfaction. The most perilous time in any protracted struggle is the conviction that victory has been achieved. This matter did not possess a conclusion, it was a beacon for police, legislators, and the people. The danger persists, the techniques will change, and the price of disregarding that fact is calculated not in money or confiscations but in human existence. The events in Seattle served as an alert inscribed in proof captures and the quiet following the tempest. Whether it turns into knowledge gained or history repeated relies on subsequent actions. When the last entryways were locked and the final crates of proof were packed, the Seattle mission formally concluded. However, what this instance unveiled did not cease with detentions, confiscations, or news banners. It laid bare something much more disturbing, a flaw not in a single town or entity but in how contemporary society perceives risk. For generations, citizens were instructed that dangers come with noise, that offense looks messy, and that peril has a recognizable look like brutality or vandalism. This investigation smashed that conviction. The events in Seattle demonstrated that the most damaging risks now enter softly via systems we rely on, bodies we honor, and habits we need daily. This syndicate did not bank on terror, it banked on ease. It counted on individuals thinking that legality implies security, that forms imply truth, and that competence implies safety. For a lengthy period, that assumption operated to their advantage. The moral here is not solely regarding narcotics, it is regarding apathy. A free civilization is strong because it is founded on faith. However, that very faith transforms into a weakness when it is taken for granted instead of confirmed. When haste supplants investigation, when fame supplants responsibility, and when folks cease asking tough queries because things appear standard, trouble arises. The households ruined by fentanyl did not falter, nor did the impacted neighborhoods avert their gaze. They were functioning under suppositions that no longer apply in a reality where criminal rings analyze our structures as intently as we construct them. This is the reason why policing by itself is insufficient. Assaults can disturb and captures can break down, but avoiding future harm now demands mindfulness at every tier. Organizations that doubt their own protections, groups that discuss hazard candidly, and relatives who realize peril no longer declares itself are essential. This instance also conveys another uneasy reality: quietness is no longer impartial. When structures are abused silently, passivity turns into a component of the issue. The conviction that such things cannot occur here is precisely what permits them to transpire. Yet there is also a justification for why this narrative counts. Because when bureaus aligned, when facts were traded, and when moves were firm, the establishment retaliated effectively. Pathways crumbled, logistics lines snapped, and existences were probably spared. This demonstrates that watchfulness is not delusion and responsibility is not elective, it is continued existence. What occurs subsequently is not merely a verdict for police or senators. It is an option for the people to remain knowledgeable, to remain involved, to challenge what feels standard, and to grasp that current menaces are enduring, orderly, and awaiting apathy. If this tale altered how you view security, confidence, or the structures surrounding you, do not keep it private. Distribute it and initiate a dialogue, because mindfulness is now a component of protection. Comment wake up if you think peril no longer appears perilous. Comment enough if 3,588 fatalities in a single year should never be tolerated. If you think the reality counts more than ease, press like so this dispatch travels farther. Because the events in Seattle were not merely a caution, they were a trial of focused duty and determination, and the price of flunking that trial is tallied in human lives.